Hey everyone, JJ Cooper, Geoff Pontes, Carlos Collazo here. Special podcast today, special video today. Top 100 prospects. Yes, we do update our top 100 multiple times during the year nowadays, thankfully. But this is the granddaddy. This is the big deal. This is the one that when we look back on the top 100 20 years from now, and I hope I'm still looking at them at that point, we're going to say who was number one in 2025. This is the list we're talking about. Geoff, Carlos, I'm excited to kind of dive into this. And I'm just going to jump right in by starting with you, Geoff, which is our number one prospect, Roki Sasaki. Was there a debate there, or was that one of those like, well, duh, Roki Sasaki is our number one prospect?
Yeah, I'll say this. If I could transport myself back and brought back, 2023 spring training Geoff Pontes, I think I probably would have been a little shocked that Roki came over and that there was some debate around who the number one prospect is. But I think that, last year, there were maybe some cracks in the facade that showed a little bit. I think as we got access to more advanced data for Sasaki and we're able to dig in a little bit, you were able to see that there were some elements of his profile that maybe could be improved. He doesn't have particularly great feel for spin. The slider is definitely a pitch that needs to improve. The fastball velocity backed up. He even talked about that. And if you've read anything about the homework assignment, was a big part of, the pitch process for all these teams. On the other side, you had a guy like Roman Anthony, who at a very young age, hit at advanced levels. Each level he climbed to seemed to get a little bit better and sort of improve throughout the season. We know what his work ethic is. And, the hitting training for the Red Sox has been phenomenal over the last couple of years. So I think there was a debate, but at the end, I don't think there were really any votes that were sort of pushing back against Sasaki being one. I think you look at, how teams valued him when you talk in terms of some of the internal models of, what the value on this player is. And, the ability for him to come right into pro ball and be part of the Dodgers rotation on this super team, and under the Dodgers tutelage, who I know we can criticize them for some pitching injuries. I think you can probably criticize everybody in baseball for some pitching injuries at this point, but do seem to get the best out of their profiles, and I think that's one of the reasons that he ended up choosing the Dodgers in the end. So while there was some debate, I don't think it was heated. But it was maybe a little bit more than we would have anticipated a few years ago if we were told Roki was coming over.
I'll kind of add to that. Like the Dodgers, understandably, Carlos and I just recorded a Braves podcast last week that's up now that you can listen to. And we touched on this. There is a part of that where we can say like, oh, the Dodgers, and clearly the Dodgers are investigating this. They're trying to figure out why so many of our guys get hurt. At the same time, they fish in the riskiest pond because they know that that's where some of the best talent is. And I would say if you keep basically acquiring and drafting and developing guys who throw nearly 100 with hellacious stuff, you're running a higher injury risk. But when they're healthy, you're also getting guys who are really, really good. They would much rather take that risk than it would. They're not looking for the guys who's a solid back of the rotation starter. Back of the rotation starters don't really fit what they're looking for. But Carlos, kind of taking off of what Geoff said there, we have a pitcher at number one on a Baseball America Top 100. We've actually written in the past, will we ever have another pitcher number one on the Baseball America Top 100? How surprised are you that we have a pitcher number one on the Baseball America Top 100?
Yeah, I think I'm less surprised that Roki is number one on the top 100 than just the quantity of pitchers we have inside the top 10. I think Roki is a unique enough talent, and this class of hitters at the very top is light enough that the fact that it happened in the same year is maybe good luck for a pitcher being in that number one spot. I think you even mentioned, JJ, in that piece a year or 2 years ago that Roki was kind of a dark horse candidate to be a potential number one overall prospect. But I'm not too surprised. I mean, if you look at the way we start this list, we have everyone submit their top 150s. 5 of us did that this year. Every single one of us had Roki number one. I think 4 of the 5 had the same top 2 players. So it's not entirely surprising. I think if you'd asked me 2 years ago, me and Ben we're talking about how would you line up Roki Sasaki, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, and Paul Skeens during his draft year when he was going nuclear. At that point, before we knew what Paul Skeens was doing at the major league level, I think we both lined it up Roki Sasaki, Paul Skeens, and then Yamamoto at the end. I think at this point you could probably give the edge to Paul Skeens because we've just seen it at the major league level. There's no risk. He has less durability risk there, but no, I think Roki's upside, his arm talent, the fact that he's going to basically immediately be in a big league rotation and have the upside to be a front end arm makes sense to put him in that number one spot. Yes, pitches are inherently more risky, but you don't often get pitching prospects of this sort of caliber. He's the highest graded player that we have on this top 100, and I think rightfully so, even with some of the questions that Geoff mentioned. But I feel confident in the Dodgers being able to sort of maximize Roki. They're going to put him in a position where he's pitching every 6 days, which should help with that durability concern. So, yeah, for me, I kind of put Roki at the top and didn't really think too much about it. And like Geoff said, there was some discussion, but it wasn't super heated, and I don't think anyone felt too uncomfortable putting a pitcher one, even though typically that probably is uncomfortable to do.
One addendum every 7 days, we think, because they're going to be a 6-man rotation, we expect. So
There you go.
every 6-man rotation, every 7, so you pitch every 7 days is the expectation for it.
Pitching on a calm schedule.
Yeah, exactly. And something that I think we're going to see more teams going to. But Geoff, you mentioned, I think Paul Skeens is useful for this. Like if we had it to do over again, we did not have Paul Skeens number one last year. We talked about the durability risk, the concerns with pitchers. But also, I think Skeens is instructive for this. If we had this to do over, if Carlos was he's been doing his, redrafting the drafts, the 2020 draft, the 2010 draft. If we re-ranked the 2024, I should say, top 100, I think we would have Paul Skeens 1 if we redid it now. But a key part of that is that Paul Skeens is a better pitcher now with a better pitch mix than he was coming out of that first draft year. Like we saw him take another step forward. I think that's instructive also. You mentioned with Roki Sasaki. Roki Sasaki is still young. He's not a finished product. The concern with him, you mentioned about, the slider and the feel for spin. If I was going to try to pick out an aspect that a young, really talented pitcher still needed to develop, I think that's the one that I would probably want to be the remaining concern for a pitcher. And I say that from the standpoint of there are so many different breaking balls now. There are so many different sliders. You don't necessarily have to have feel for spin even to develop a breaking ball that is and again, he has the split. Let's be clear. The splits, and we have the split rated as a top of the scale an 80. But how comfortable are you that goes to the Dodgers? They're going to figure out a breaking ball, whether that's a slider, whatever it is, whether it's a gyro slider, whether it's a sweeper, whether it's a traditional slider, whether some form of a slider, some form of a breaking ball that's going to become kind of that third pitch that fits, that kind of helps the fastball and split that are already exceptional kind of find another gear.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of sort of power and shape. When it comes to the breaking ball here, he's not going to be a guy that's probably ever going to get his spin rates up to like 2,500 or some area like that. It's a pronation dominant profile, which is one of the reasons that he has the great splitter and all that. I think, one of the things that he had sort of said ahead of time is that my velocity dropped last year, and I want to explore why that was the case. I think with a pitcher like this, throwing a breaking ball as hard as he possibly can, if he can throw something that's in that 85 to 88 plus sort of range consistently, it probably cures some of the ills of not being able to spin the heck out of it or create certain types of shape. The other thing is, though he threw it more than his splitter, it is a pitch that I think, you look at the fastball, you look at the splitter, it kind of only has to work in certain spots, right? And I think one of the things that we heard from scouts is, we were doing some of the background work on Sasaki and those that had seen him and done work overseas, is that, the sequencing and some of the pitchability stuff still needs to come along. So I think when you consider that and can kind of come up with maybe a more cohesive game plan that utilizes that slider in certain spots and then can accentuate things like velocity or certain types of movement in concert with velocity, ultimately that could lead to another gear. And I think, the Skeens comparison is apt, but, for us, I guess we just didn't know he had this pitch. And I started talking to some people that, had coached him in high school even, or been around him in Air Force. It was something that he had in his arsenal. I don't think anybody realized it was going to be the best pitch in the world. I mean, it was the best pitch in the major leagues last year. And I think that changes the evaluation so much. He was a good pitcher. We knew he had a great slider. We knew he could throw the pill as hard as anybody on earth, just about. I don't think we knew that he had this like combo breaking ball off speed pitch that was hard, had dynamic movement, and tunneled really well off of the rest of his stuff. But I also think it shows that players that have this sort of ability have an aptitude to maybe pick up some of those traits on pitches that other guys just simply can't. So it would be foolhardy after learning that lesson last year to completely write off him adding, an above average breaking ball at some point by major league standards, at least.
Roman Anthony's number 2 on our list. And I would say, like, if Sasaki had not come over, pretty clearly, I think Roman Anthony went to number 1 on our list last August. We are proud of the fact that our list in January now is still important, but at the same time, we kind of scoop ourselves because if we're doing our jobs right, we're getting there during last season. When we're something where if you subscribe to Baseball America, we're hoping that we're giving you a pretty solid sneak peek of our offseason top 100 because we're doing the work all during the season. We kept getting the feedback last year, keep moving Roman Anthony up, keep moving Roman Anthony up. I would say in hindsight, if you look at our August list, I would say Christian Campbell, we moved him way up. And then if you see this top 100, we moved him up a good bit further now. But Carlos, like if Sasaki wasn't part of this, wasn't eligible for this list, would Roman Anthony be the best of a subpar lot number 1? Or is it more something where you look at it and say, this is a guy who would be a solid number 1 kind of just most any year?
Yeah, I would say maybe like for an average year, Roman Anthony makes a lot of sense as a number 1 prospect. I don't think he is the sort of 1-1 that we had when we had guys like Bobby Witt Jr., Julio Rodriguez, or Adley Rutschman. Like I think that grouping was really impressive. Years before that, when we had Ronald Acuna Jr. at the very top, I don't know if he's that sort of talent, but I do think, he is a tremendous athlete. He's got lots of tools. He has hit at a high level, so he's checked a lot of the boxes that you want for a hitter who's ranking at the top. I just think there's maybe some upside that some of the players we've seen in the past probably have, whether that's positionally or defensive value, speed. He doesn't check all boxes with like 70s across the board, and we have had that at times. So I don't think this is like a Bobby Wood Jr. level, and we didn't even have Bobby Wood Jr. number 1 at the time. It was kind of a trio of players who were all fairly elite. But I do think Roman Anthony is extremely solid. Geoff mentioned aptitude and the ability to make adjustments for these elite players. I think what Roman Anthony has done in his pro career and even late in his high school career has shown his aptitude. He had a real swing and miss approach questions at the time of the draft. That's part of the reason the Red Sox were able to get him as low in the draft as they did. And basically, as soon as he came into pro ball, the contact rates that he was showing were significantly improved. He maintained that while also still maintaining his really impressive raw power. I saw this kid hit a home run when he was 17 years old in a big league park that I was just kind of stunned by. And now he's layered on an advanced approach as a left-handed hitter. He's young. He does a lot of things really well. So yeah, I think he's a very solid number 1. I'm curious, like if you guys would quibble with kind of how I'm placing him, because I'm talking about him pretty positively, and I think I'm probably the lowest in our office on Roman Anthony. So
I was starting with you because I was going to then go to Geoff, and I would say that Geoff has been kind of one of the high men on Roman Anthony and Christian Campbell for quite a while for us.
To be clear, for me, low is 3, so
right.
It's not like I had him super far down.
Carlos doesn't hate Roman Anthony; he just had him 3. But yeah, and it was the only person who didn't have him 2 on our list.
Yep.
But Geoff, kind of along those lines, if I go through recent years, last year Jackson Holliday number 1, previous year Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Wander Franco, who obviously 2 years in a row off the field has kind of changed the assessment on that one. But Vladimir Guerrero Jr., Ronald Acuna, that's basically 2018 to present. If you were fitting Roman Anthony, and it's always tough to do this because we're saying compared to where those guys were then. Jackson Holliday, we're expecting kind of a bounce back year this year, but last year was not as solid for him. I would say in the case of Gunnar Henderson, we really loved him. He was our number 1 prospect. I would say that our assessment maybe even has gone up a little bit since then. But if you're comparing them to where they were contemporaneously when they were number 1, where would Roman Anthony to you slot on that group?
Yeah, I'd have him above Holiday. And I think, just based on the player, going back a year, I was a little bit more skeptical of Holiday just because of the lack of power and impact. Still thought he was a very good prospect. Still thought it was a 70 hit. So I certainly haven't been right by any measures either. We all thought this guy was an elite player. I would probably put him a little bit behind Gunnar. I think the bat is probably pretty comparable. It's better bat to ball skills than Gunnar had. Maybe a tick better power, but both sort of elite EV guys. Swing decisions are pretty similar. The edge, I think, goes to Gunnar just simply because he can play shortstop versus, center field and right field, which is where primarily I think Anthony, depending upon, how they play him in Fenway, because right field is more of a challenge there than most parks. So sometimes you will put your better defender there. Jackie Bradley played there for some years. So, I think when I look at it, he's probably behind Gunnar, certainly not in the same conversation as Adley Rutschman or Acuna or the guys that were ranked with Acuna, which I believe was Shohei Ohtani, or the guys that were ranked with Adley, with Julio Rodriguez, who might be a little bit more comparable to Roman Anthony, but I would say was a little bit more advanced. And Bobby Witt Jr., who obviously is one of the best players in the world, one of the few people that can have a conversation and go toe to toe with Shohei Ohtani or Aaron Judge or one of those guys. So I think it's, sort of mid tier. I don't think it's a bad number one necessarily. And then the Franco one, obviously the off-field thing, but in terms of the player evaluation, he got up to the big leagues immediately, was a star and got that contract. And from a player evaluation standpoint, obviously wasn't bad. And I would probably, from a play standpoint, put him above Anthony. But I think that, he is a number one type of prospect that's in that kind of conversation. It's just simply, he's not among those elite guys where you're like, I'm looking at this guy and I might be looking at a Hall of Famer. You're looking at Anthony, be like, this is a guy that might get MVP votes and could be a multi-time All-Star. There's a difference there.
Okay. The next thing I want to do, I want to play a similar game on this, looking at the rest of the top 10. Is there a guy on the rest and somewhere else in the 10 that would not surprise you if he ended up being the best of this whole group, this whole top 10? Not the whole 100, but the whole top 10. Is there someone else? We're going to get into this right after this quick break. And we're back. So, okay, for each of you, I'll start with you, Carlos. Is there someone in the top 10 here who you think, you know what, we could look back on this 10, 15, 20 years from now and say, okay, Roki Sasaki was really fine. He was a solid, but there was some injuries there. Roman Anthony ended up being JD Drew, which is kind of the comparison he's been, where you're like, JD Drew was a really good player, but he wasn't the best player from that class or whatever. Is there someone in here you would be like, yeah, I'm not surprised at all that player X ended up being the best of that group?
So this is my time to gush about Dylan Cruz.
There you go.
I think he's obviously
I'm putting it on a T for you. We're going to do some light T work here.
Yeah, so if Roki Sasaki didn't exist, Dylan Cruz would be my number one prospect. I think that Dylan Cruz does everything you want from a hitter, from a position player in baseball. I think he is, if you look at just our tools, how we break them down in the prospect handbook with all of our top 30s, I think he's top 2 in terms of just impact tools. He can hit for power, he can run, he can field, he can play all 3 outfield positions. He's got a strong arm. For me, I am just purely bought into his ability to adapt, his ability to hit, and his ability to get to his power with more frequency in time. I know the people who are most skeptical of Dylan Cruz probably point to the fact that he hits a lot of balls on the ground. He hits a lot of balls the other way. And so there is a lot of this exit velocity that he's maybe not optimizing for in game. I think there's a possibility that he's just a hitter who's going to use all fields and just be a hit collector at a high level, and he'll naturally just get to his power without really seeking it out or pulling everything in the air. I'm just very, very bullish and very high on his hitting ability. Watching him really from the time he was an underclassman in high school through college, seeing how he sees the ball, how he adjusts. Personally, I think his ability to shoot the ball the opposite field is a strength. So if it comes a time where, based on his production, he needs to make some adjustments and just turn on the ball with more intention, I think he'll be able to do that. I think he's a guy who, depending, again, kind of how Geoff mentioned with Roman Anthony, how the Nationals are running out their fielders, I think he'll either be a very solid center fielder or a very good outfielder in a corner. And I think at this point, while Dylan Cruz we still have pretty high on our list overall. I do think there is some sort of discounting on the prospect that he is, just because his minor league production has been sort of fine for a player of his caliber. He's already gotten to the major leagues. I expect him to have a really big 2025. So just from a tool set perspective, from a pure hitting ability, I'm very, very high on Dylan Cruz. So he would be the answer for me here.
I kind of figured that's where Carlos was going to go. I'm a little bit less certain where Jeff's going to go. So, Jeff, is there someone you see in the top 10 who you think could end up being the best player out of this group?
Yeah, I'm going to stay here with some Boston Red Sox prospects, and I'm going to call out Christian Campbell. And it's funny because a lot of what Carlos had just said about Dylan Cruz, I think I kind of feel very similarly about Christian Campbell. Just the adjustments that he made coming into pro ball. Talk about aptitude. A guy who was a speed and contact guy that a lot of area scouts were just sort of, saw several times throughout high school and college, played at a big program, I believe, in East Cobb in high school as well. So it wasn't like this guy, was hidden from scouts. And the fact that he changed his profile so dramatically in a year and then really put up kind of a historic offensive season when you consider all of the things he did, the levels that he climbed, seemingly got better at each level. And it was funny, you had called out earlier how we had really shoved Christian Campbell up the list. But the things that he showed over that last month after we re-ranked in AAA kind of did push him a little bit more. And then some of the feedback that we were getting from the team in terms of how he looked in the offseason workouts, because there were a lot of guys they probably could have sent out to Arizona Fall League. They didn't do that. They kept everything sort of internal there in Florida and ran some of their programs. The fact that there could be another gear here and another level, and just the general excitement and apprehension to even consider Campbell in any deal alongside Roman Anthony, as the Red Sox were looking to, bolster this pitching staff and roster throughout the season, I think speaks volumes about where they view Campbell. I think he's somebody that could potentially walk into a major league job out of camp. They're probably not going to do that with Anthony. I think it's possible with Campbell. Can play a multitude positions. Saw time at second base, saw time at shortstop, saw time at third base and center field. That versatility as well could lend itself to getting him into the lineup and providing some value. He's a really good athlete. Like I said, the EVs really took off. You guys sat through a great presentation at the ABCA conference from one of the hitting coordinators with the Red Sox, sort of going through the changes and how they got to this point with Christian Campbell. That to me, I feel like we've been playing catch up seemingly since spring training. We got some buzz that came in very early in March that was like, hey, watch out for Christian Campbell. This could be the guy. But you don't know. We're still in that silly season at that point where there's a lot of feedback, a lot of information coming in. And when it's from team sources, you take it not with a grain of salt, but you discount it a little bit. How good is this guy going to be? I think we all realized that he was a top 30 Red Sox prospect. We didn't consider that he was going to be a top 3 to 5 prospect in the game come a year later. And here we are. So I think it's tough because he's the only one, I think, in this top 10 that doesn't have any extensive amateur track record, even kind of backing that potential superstardom. So it could go either way, but just what the gains were, I think it's so hard for us to catch up, and it could be an interesting one to follow over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Who's your guy, JJ?
I was going to say a lot of the case for Campbell, I would say that I kind of agree with, because if you asked me, kind of going back to that catching up with, I can look at both sides. There is a possibility that Christian Campbell just had basically his 95th percentile season, and you say, we look at this a year from now and go, he's still really good. He's a big leaguer and all this, but everything just came together in this perfect season that was perfectly constructed to make him a top 10 prospect, right? Like you have the narrative, you have the performance, you have him playing at basically going from A ball to AAA, playing everywhere, including shortstop. All these things come together. So that's like and then we look back on it and say, you know what? It was a short track record because what he was in his 1 year at Georgia Tech was not that kind of guy. So then we could say, oh, in hindsight, like we got a little overheated by not just the statistical production, but the underlying metrics and all behind that as well. Everything kind of returned back to earth a little bit. That's possible. The flip side of it is the reason if Christian Campbell had Dylan Cruz's college resume and the season he just had, he'd be number one on our top 100 with Roki Sasaki here. It would be like, what else could you want? The guy who hit 430 in college, who was the best hitter in college for multiple years, then goes out and is Baseball America's minor league player of the year. He can play second, he can play short, he can play third, he can play center, he can play left, he can play right. You would put all that together and say, and by the way, he's a contemporary. I mean, we're not talking about like age-wise and all, that this guy's a different level. We would then say, with that resume, we'd be like, this is everything you could possibly hope to see in a number one prospect. So we just have less information. So like I can look at it, I can spin it both ways. One way is last year was everything possible Christian Campbell can do. The other is we're just scratching the surface. But if he had that resume that some of the other guys we're talking about had, we would just be like, I love Roman Anthony, but I mean, if you're comparing these two guys, this guy's bat is every bit as good, maybe better. Oh yeah, by the way, he can also play in the dirt wherever you need him to play. He's athletic, all these things. But then I will throw out like a little teaser. I'm not going to give a full version of it, but I think that Carlos would also, if he wasn't, the answer if he had not given Dylan Cruz, the other answer I could see Carlos at least throwing out there that I'll throw out there is, when we talk about Walker Jenkins, that is a scratch. He is still scratching the surface of who Walker Jenkins could be. He already was good. Like, don't make it sound like, I don't want to make it sound in any way like Walker Jenkins hasn't shown solid ability in pro ball. But he's a year younger than Roman Anthony. He's basically going into the season that Roman Anthony had last year, right? And he's kind of positioned at about the same point from the standpoint of where is he going to play this year and all that. If you told me that a healthy Walker Jenkins, and he started last year, he had some injury issues and all that really got him, he got a slow start because of that. It wasn't a 2024 season where we got to see the full effect of what Walker Jenkins can do. If you told me that Walker Jenkins this year had a minor league player of the year caliber year, where we're not going to get to rank him number one then next year probably because he'll be in the big leagues too soon for that to be the case. But he's another guy. Like, if I was going to describe my shorthand of it right now, it would be like, imagine a Joe Mauer type, but playing in the outfield, where it's a hit first, but there should be power there. We always said that with Joe Mauer, and Joe Mauer, who did have some back issues and all, concussions and all, like Joe Mauer was still ended up being a much more of a pure hitter than a pure slugger, but he still, even with that, he was an incredibly productive offensive player. That's kind of where I don't want to say he's going to be Joe Mauer if it doesn't work out as a hitter. That's way too much to put on a guy. Like, he's going to win batting title after batting title and will come away disappointed at the end that, what would have happened if he'd just really been good? But what I mean by that is that if Walker Jenkins never gets to the full extent of his power potential, he'll just be this really good pure hitter who can play an athletic center field early in his career, probably right field long term, good defensively, all these aspects. And then if you said, oh, by the way, as he turned 20, 21, 22, he got into that swing a little bit more. He started hunting for, pitches and advantageous counts and destroying them a little bit more. He traded off 10, 15, 20 points of batting average and OBP for 60, 70, 80 points of slugging. None of that would surprise me. And if that happened, then he could be the guy that we look back on this. I would say that kind of leads to my next question. I'll go to you first, Geoff, but I'm really excited about this as we talk about this for a list that I think we would all agree. The top 10 here is not as star-studded as far as like comparing it to recent years, because let's just be honest, you all talked about it. We had a year where it was Adley Rutschman, Julio Rodriguez, and Bobby Witt Jr., and we said at that time, we said, here's these trio. You can make the case for any one of these number one. And these are all guys who would be a slam dunk number one most years. I look at that a couple years later, and I would still say that. Same year, we had the year that was Ronald Acuna, Shohei Ohtani, and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. You look at that now, almost a decade later, and again, you would say, okay, Ohtani has ended up being the class of that. But Ronald Acuna is a multiple-time MVP, even with a pair of significant knee injuries. And we're still saying like he's number 2. These are all guys who would be slam dunk number 1s in a normal year. Geoff, is this list a little thinner than a normal top 10 at the top?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can look at the fact that we have 6 pitchers in the top 10 and kind of call that out immediately. Maybe 1 or 2, 3 even, pretty reasonable. The fact that they outnumber hitters, I think, is a pretty significant statement when you look at it overall. What would you say, Carlos, on that? I'm sure you probably have a similar opinion.
I mean, I entirely agree. I think you could look at 6 pitchers in the top 10 and say, oh, it's a really good year for pitchers. And maybe there is some of that. But to me, it more is that there are just fewer hitters who have the combination of tools, upside, and upper level experience. I mean, we've talked about this a lot over the last year or so, but players are just moving through the minor leagues so quickly now. You don't get another chance at like a Wyatt Langford ranking on this list, for instance. Like he's
and Evan Carter.
Yeah, I mean Evan Carter. I mean, tons of guys have flown through, and you're getting fewer opportunities to capture them in a list. So I think a lot of it is just these guys are already at the major league level and they don't qualify. But I also just think that there are a lot of players with maybe more questions than we would typically have or typically want for hitters inside the top 10. Though all these pitchers we have high, I'm pretty excited about, but any of them could rake at any given moment. That's the issue with pitching prospects. The volatility is just so high. So yeah, I entirely agree with what you said.
What I would just add to that is to give it another example. Jackson Chourio has a full year in the big leagues. He would still be middle of the pack age wise as far as this top 100. He'd spent all last year as a 20-year-old. Jackson Holiday no longer eligible. Will be playing next year as a 21-year-old. Jackson Merrill, James Wood. There's a lot of guys who are making that leap to where James Wood was number 1 on our top 100 during the season last year before he came up to the big leagues. He's graduated. He would be a fun one to be discussing, if we're comparing Roman Anthony to James Wood, that's a fascinating debate. We don't get that debate right now. Again, in reality, they're both still players, but as you talk about from the standpoints of prospect eligibility, we're not debating James Wood versus Roman Anthony. Although, Geoff, I will put you on the spot because I know these are both 2 of your guys. James Wood versus Roman Anthony. Who would you prefer to have long term?
I'm gonna not answer the question in true political fashion and say that it's kind of the Spider-Man meme of 2 guys kind of pointing at each other. I feel like the same issues that I have that I could call out with Anthony, I can call out with Wood, just in terms of optimizing that hard contact. Very similar defensive profiles. Wood's a slightly better athlete, a little bit faster, but I believe in the bat to ball skill, I think, a little bit more with Anthony. So I feel like they're kind of in the same bucket. If we're bucketing out archetypes, they're going to both fit into that same bucket. And I said it's a little bit of that spider meme kind of pointing back and forth. So on any given day, I could probably go Anthony or Wood, frankly.
So y'all both hit on it, that this is lighter on upper level hitters. There are interesting hitters in the minors right now. We don't want to make it sound like there's not. There are interesting hitters in the minors. However, the majority of guys we're talking about, like we just talked about with Christian Campbell has really 1 year of production at this level. He only has 1 year he only has 1 year in the minors effectively. A little bit of time in, after the draft the year before that. Roman Anthony has multiple years in the minors. That's why he's number 1, is that Roman Anthony does now have multiple years of production, tools, and upper level production, AA, AAA. Dylan Cruz has the long resume, has the tools. And as we talked about, like in his case, I would say his 2024 season, both in the minors and the majors, was solid, but wasn't spectacular. But he's still in the top 10. I would go a little bit out of the top 10. We talk about like a Carson Williams, like a Bryce Eldridge, like a Samuel Basallo. Those are all guys who are really interesting. Williams did have most of last year at AA and still has some, I would say, some hit tool concerns. The power, the defense, all that are really. Bryce Eldridge did get to AAA, but I would say that his AA, his upper level minor league time is very thin so far. We expect him to fix that in 2025. But the other thing is, he's a first baseman, so you're really betting on the bat. And then Basallo was slowed early in the season by an injury, does have some upper level time, but there are still defensive questions about whether he's going to be long term. Probably will be a catcher, but like it's not a 100% slam dunk. Oh, Adley move aside or anything like that. And I can even go a little bit further down on this list and talk about like maybe if Emmanuel Rodriguez had been healthy all year, we'd be talking about him in this group because he has kind of these outlier skills, I would say, to go with some tools. But at the same time, Emmanuel Rodriguez, as we often do, we're talking about him and saying, man, if we just see a full season where he's healthy for the full year and shows us what he can do, which is, I feel like we may have said that on a podcast for the top 100 in 2023.
The most remarkable thing about Rodriguez, too, because I've been doing some fantasy work on the side with, of course, Dylan, and we talk about a lot of players. We were kind of joking around today. If you take a look at what their outfield is with Larnach in left field, with Byron Buxton consistently hurt, Michael Hellman, kind of the backup defender, outfield defender on that roster, who has 3 options remaining. You have Emmanuel Rodriguez, who's been on the 40-man roster for a year, already burned an option. It's reasonable that the most at bats he ever gets in the season could be this year in the major leagues. Like there's a pathway that could be the case, that the longest sort of streak we see of playing time from Emmanuel Rodriguez could actually be at the game's highest level. And I don't think there's anyone we could have said that about since like Juan Soto. Now they're different players, and Soto's and Emmanuel Rodriguez's journeys were very different in terms of why there wasn't a lot of minor league experience or time. But I do think it's kind of an unusual angle with Emmanuel Rodriguez, because there are a lot of teams, and we talked to some front offices, there are teams that value him as a top 5 prospect, especially more analytical teams that lean on sort of a value-based model as their ultimate, final say. So he's a really interesting prospect. I think of anybody on this list that I would call out that I find to be the most fascinating prospect, it's probably Emmanuel Rodriguez.
I don't want to basically sell short the pitchers. We talked about there's a lot of pitchers in this top 10. I'm going to start with you, Geoff. Okay, we talked about Sasaki, but of these pitchers, who's like, actually, I'm going to frame it this way. Bubba Chandler, I would say, not that we didn't always kind of really like Bubba Chandler, but I would say that when you look at the guys in the top 10 here, Bubba's the one who probably has come the furthest in the past year. Like, Jackson Jobe has kind of been living in this world for a long time. Andrew Painter, it was just like, just be healthy. We're just asking you to come back and be healthy. I would say that Chase Dollander, like obviously that was a guy who was a premium dude in the draft just a couple of years ago. And I would also say, like even going to Noah Schultz we're really just saying with Noah Schultz right now, please be healthy and pitch the 5th inning. Maybe a 6th every now and then would be nice. But Bubba's the one who's kind of taken that big step forward. What did Bubba Chandler do to where now we consider him not just one of the better pitching prospects in baseball, but one of the best pitching prospects in baseball?
Yeah, it's really unusual because if, you coming out of the 2022 season, if we line these 3 guys up, it's Painter 1 easily, Jobe 2 easily, and then Bubba 3. And I don't even think we're really having the same conversation that we're having after the other 2 guys. Last year, coming into the season, after the Painter injury, it's Jobe. I think people probably have Painter above Bubba almost across the board. A lot of relief questions, I think, and risks still coming into the season. Throughout the year, he showed development of the arsenal. He showed development of the pitchability and just, not having to blow it by everybody every single time to get the outs. And credit to the Pirates, I think, as well. We've seen, even beyond skiing, some solid pitching development within that organization, which gives us maybe a little bit, more optimism around a Pirates pitching prospect than, we might be around a White Sox or whatever. So I think that leads in. But when we look at these pitchers and then we line up those, we'll say 3 guys that are on the cusp of the major leagues that we all anticipate will pitch in the big leagues this year, in Painter, in Bubba, and in Jobe, who of course got up there last year. I think I would honestly say that the best fastball goes to Bubba. And that's saying something, because Painter's always gotten a ton of ride and cut on that fastball from the upper 90s. Jackson Jobe gets a ton of ride and arm side run. It's a great fastball, also in the upper 90s. But Bubba, in terms of the approach angle and some of those other little elements of deception that come along with everything, I think he has that over those other guys. Now, I think from an arsenal standpoint, you could probably argue Jobe because of how deep his arsenal is, the fact that he has, high efficiency fastball shape and also has really good feel for spin. Those are unique qualities that not a lot of guys have. And I think it's really for me at least, it's kind of a battle between those two, because I do have some questions about Painter, particularly coming off of Tommy John surgery and just how long it takes for command and sort of the pinpoint command that Painter really thrived with, for that to come back. And we might see it, we might not. And we also know that the Phillies are going to handle him with a little bit of kid gloves, where that might not be the case with Bubba. He might see 130 innings this year in the big leagues. It wouldn't be an absolute shock.
I understand if you're a Pirates fan, you should be frustrated right now. Like, I don't know if Anthony Santander would have signed with the Pirates, but man, like a guy like that would have, if they would have just been willing to actually spend some money in free agency to kind of really help this lineup. But you look at a rotation that's going to have Skeens, Jared Jones, Mitch Keller, that probably is going to add Bubba Chandler and probably could add Thomas Harrington this year too. That's really good. That's really important. That's really impressive. That really could be interesting, especially now, though, again, there's a frustration that you wish that they had a little bit more lineup help to go with this. But Carlos, the other one I want to make sure, Geoff touched on Jackson Jobe. But when you look at where Jackson Jobe is now and you rewind it to kind of like where he was coming into the draft, like he had very high expectations. He was that prep pitcher going at the top of the draft, which, a lot of people would say, oh, that's a really, really frightening demographic, the prep right-hander going at the top of the draft. Although I would point out, we're actually seeing now a little bit more of a success rate with that. Hunter Green waves his hand and says, hey, you could have Hunter Green, you could have Kyle Wright, or you could have Brendan McKay. You know what? Sometimes the prep pitchers do end up being the best of the group. But Carlos, when you look at Jobe where he is now, I kind of feel like, I think I wrote in our Tigers scouting report from that if you were going to design almost like the perfect pitching prospect, you would have a lot of Jobe traits. What is he, what do you see now and what do you kind of expect to see out of him going forward?
Yeah, and just really quickly on the high school pitchers, Bubba Chandler, who Geoff was just talking about, high school pitcher. I mean, he was a two-way player. Andrew Painter, high school pitcher. So a lot of the guys at the top of our top 100 on any given year are high school
Noah
pitchers who had
Schultz.
massive tools, massive upside, and have stayed healthy. So I think more teams should be willing to take the risk on the high school pitchers. But yeah, Jackson Jobe, like you said, I just think he checks all the boxes that you want to see. He's a phenomenal athlete. He has been a phenomenal athlete for a long time. He's got a 4-pitch mix really across the board. I think you could say all those pitches are plus. The fastball has long been plus. The slider has long been a double plus pitch. He made strides with the changeup during his draft spring season. People are like, wait, the spin monster who has this 3,000 RPM slider all of a sudden has a changeup that's a plus pitch in high school. It's not super common for high school pitchers to have changeups that good who also spin the ball that well. Typically, it's more one or the other. That's why he goes top 5 in a draft. He's got command. I just think he checks all the boxes. He throws hard. He's got a fastball with good shape. He misses bats with all these pitches. What does Jackson Jobe not do that you want a top pitcher to do? I guess that's a question. Maybe you haven't quite seen it in the majors in a starting capacity.
Sequencing.
He pitched. Yeah, okay, there you go. You would know better than me. But I just think from a tool perspective, from an athlete perspective, I think he has all the tools you need to have success. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about the sequencing.
The only knocks I'm hearing so far when I was doing the Tigers list is they're kind of young pitcher problems, which is there were times where you're like, okay, dude, you blew this guy away on pitch 1 and pitch 2 of a fastball. Why did you go, why did you show him 2 other pitches and end up at 2-2 or 3-2 before
I'm curious how much teams are putting that on Jobe versus the catchers. Like how much are their catchers just kind of steering the game versus how much say Jobe has? Like that feels like something where there should be a little interplay between the battery there, but that's interesting.
I do think that, and I also do think that the Tigers very much are an organization. I think it's working out well for them. I think that you would point to Tigers pitching development right now and say it's doing a really good job. But I do think that they emphasize varied repertoires and having multiple ways. Like they want to make sure every one of their starting pitchers is going to have a way to attack righties and is going to have a way to attack left-handed hitters. Like they're going to, and if that means that you almost need to be 2 different pitchers, they're good with that. But I would say, it's one of those things where I don't fault the idea of like, you know what, your 5th start in the year in Double-A Erie is not about your success today. You want to have success, but it's really focused on making sure that you're the best big leaguer down the road. And so maybe that's a little bit of this as well. Like, oh, today we're working on this. Today we're working on that. And to be honest, with a guy like Jackson Jobe, I would actually give some credit to that, to him and them, from the standpoint of like, we've seen examples of pitchers who just kind of cruise their way through even AA, where it's like, okay, this guy can do this and dominate hitters at this level. It may not work at the majors, but he'll deal with that when he gets to that point. Yeah, but you're trying to develop, and a guy like Jackson Jobe may not really face the hitters who can teach him those lessons until he gets to the majors. So they're kind of working some of that in at the level before that. I am not surprised to say that we're going to do a 2-part Top 100 Prospects podcast, because we're basically a podcast length, video here, also length, and we've basically just covered the top 10. Doesn't surprise me at all. That's not a bad thing. We hope you really enjoy it. If you are enjoying this and you aren't a Baseball America subscriber, we would just suggest go to baseballamerica.com and join us. The whole top 100 is there. Look, I know we're going to get a comment or two saying, why didn't you just list out everyone in the top 100? baseballamerica.com. We're trying to cover a lot of these guys, but we're not going to sit here and go, at number 9, we have Andrew Painter. Here's a scouting report on Andrew Painter. I don't think that would be a particularly compelling podcast or video. And on top of that, that's what we have the website for. But we do hope you really enjoyed this. Join us at baseballamerica.com, whether you're on a podcast or where you're watching us on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, please subscribe, like it. And by the way, add a comment, and we want to continue the conversation. We appreciate that. We also leave us a review on your favorite podcast provider. And if you enjoy this, also at the YouTube channel on our podcast feed, we're doing organizational deep dive, farm system deep dives, where we take a look at the prospects in each organization. If you enjoyed what we talked about with Jackson Jobe, or you enjoyed what we talked about Roman Anthony, Christian Campbell, we're going to have a full focused Red Sox pod, Tigers pod. We're doing that for all 30 teams. We've got a couple of them up now. We're going to keep them coming one day after another. We only took a break for the top 100 day, a 1-day break, but we're going to keep those rolling out every weekday. There's a lot there at baseballamerica.com. College top 25, new preseason top 25 coming out. By the time you're watching this, it may already be there, but we're doing that on next Monday as we record this. We're going to update our top 30s with the international prospects and fill that out, scouting reports for everyone, for 30 prospects in 30 teams. Fantasy coverage, like Geoff mentioned, it's all up there. So much to just check out, baseballamerica.com. For Carlos, for Geoff, I'm JJ. So long, everybody.